edition is focused on how to monitor the count in real time. So we've got some really great speakers that you'll hear from today, and that we'll introduce in a moment. As you'll see on the slide, on the next slide, the Census Counts campaign is a collaborative campaign of national organizations and state partners across the country. Many of you are a part, that are providing resources and planning to ensure that we get out the count in 2020 and ensure a fair and full and accurate 2020 census. One of the ways we do that is through educational series like the one that you are participating on right now. There are also plenty of resources available on censuscounts.org if you're looking for in-language resources or background about specific topics, or more about the topics that you're about to hear from today. I do just want to note that not all answers will be provided on today's webinar, and more resources on this topic and others are in the works, including on the upcoming webinars, and will be available. So now I'm going to turn the call over to our partner in this webinar series, Jocelyn Bissonnette from the Funders Census Initiative. Jocelyn.
Great. Thank you, Beth. If we could, again, my name is Jocelyn Bissonnette. I'm the director of the Funders Census Initiative at the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. And we're so pleased to co-host this webinar series with the Census Counts campaign. FCI is a growing network where more than 400 funders can connect, access resources, and mobilize for a fair and accurate census. And along with the FCCP staff, FCI has a dedicated leadership team to help direct our work. In addition, I want to highlight the Democracy Funders Collaborative Census Subgroup and the United Philanthropy Forum, who are both supporting and partnering with us to help mobilize philanthropic engagement towards a fair and accurate 2020 census. I did want to note the webinars that have been part of this series. If we can go to the next slide, you can see the number of topics that we've covered already, as well as the upcoming webinars in this series. All of the recordings and slide decks from the previous webinars are available on both the FCI and the Census Counts campaign website. A few logistics for today's webinar. This is a 60-minute call, and again, both the recording and the slide deck will be available on the Census Counts and FCI websites within the week. And finally, today's hosting organizations are 501c3 organizations, meaning we do not support or oppose candidates running for public office. And we ask that all presentations, questions, and comments be respectful of our nonpartisan status. And with that, I'm going to introduce the moderator for today's discussion. Marie Alfonso-Jones, who's a senior program officer with the Long Island Community Foundation, where she manages grant-making programs in the areas of education, environment, and youth and community development. Prior to the foundation, she's worked at Sustainable Long Island, the Fight for Families Coalition, Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, and also spent 5 years as a community liaison in Governor Cuomo's Office of Hispanic Affairs. She has a degree from the University of Rochester and a certification from the Columbia Business School's Nonprofit Management Program and the American Express Nonprofit Executive Leadership Program. And most relevant for today's webinar, she has deep expertise on the census and is very engaged both in her community and nationally. She serves on the steering committee for the New York State Census Equity Fund and also serves as co-chair of the Funders Census Initiative. So Marie, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jocelyn. We're lucky to have two incredibly knowledgeable individuals presenting today who've been super supportive and instrumental in our census mobilization efforts in New York State, which I know is true for so many of my colleagues across the country. The Long Island Community Foundation is a suburban division of the New York Community Trust. Our geographic area includes Nassau and Suffolk counties, the 8th and 6th hardest to count areas in New York State, respectively. I cut my teeth in census engagement in 2009 as a new program officer preparing for what seemed at the time to be a daunting effort to count our rapidly changing population. We organized the Funder Collaborative that worked with the 2 county governments to establish complete count committees and we awarded more than $500,000 to 22 community-based organizations to improve census participation in our hardest to count committees. We relied heavily on the expertise of Terri and CUNY Graduate Center's hard to count mapping site, which had just been developed, to focus our grant-making strategies, leverage and marshal resources, and inform the efforts of our Complete Count Committee members. During the self-response and non-response follow-up periods, while census outreach efforts were in full swing, the weekly response rates published by the Census Bureau were incredibly important in helping us and community and government partners gauge what was working, identify where the gaps were so we could shift resources, messaging, and assistance to areas that needed the more targeted support. For the funder group, this included awarding rapid response mini grants and connecting our grantees and community partners with national stakeholders. For grantees, it helped them deploy limited resources. And for Complete Count committee members and stakeholders, it helped them prioritize their activities, such as which places of worship needed to add an extra message about census in their services, which neighborhood activity and or meeting needed a visit or call to action from trusted representatives, and working with local ethnic radio stations to make being counted a contest and sending encouraging shout outs to those areas lagging behind. In all of these instances, getting this information in real time helped our region react effectively while there was still time. This made a huge difference on Long Island, where there were increases in self-response rates in every area that had focused census activity and investment, some as significant as 21%. Additionally, having the data on the progress of census operations throughout the process was and will again be essential for helping us evaluate funder investment and get out the campaigns after the census is over. For 2020 planning, this data helped us get 2 new county executives on board while allocating county resources for Complete Count committees much earlier and easier than in 2010. For these reasons, understanding and planning for how you will use this data to inform investments and activities is really critically important. With that, I'll introduce the speakers. So Terri Lowenthal, we all know and love, is a nationally recognized expert and frequent speaker on the U.S. Census and policy issues affecting federal statistics. She serves as a consultant to the Leadership Conference Education Fund and the Funders Census Initiative. Steve Romalewski, which we also love, directs the mapping service at the Center for Urban Research at the City University of New York's Graduate Center, which specializes in online applications providing intuitive access to powerful data sets displayed visually through interactive maps and other formats. In 2010, and now again for the 2020, the mapping service provides online maps and data analysis to help census advocates and trusted partners to focus their outreach educational efforts. Steve was awarded a Refson Fellowship at Columbia University and received an advanced urban planning degree from Columbia. He also teaches GIS to urban planning graduate students at Pratt Institute. We're lucky to have both of them. Throughout today's webinar, please make sure of the Q&A box to submit questions. We'll add them to the queue for our discussion after the 2 presentations. As Beth mentioned, not all answers will be provided on today's webinar, but the slide deck and recording of this webinar will be available online, along with the other resources for the full operations series. I'll now turn it over to Terri and Steve.
Great. Thank you so much, Sol Marie. Hello, everyone. It is always a privilege to be able to talk to you about the census, the work that stakeholders and funders are doing to support fair and accurate 2020 census, are really where the rubber meets the road. You know, I think today's webinar marks an important pivot to helping you finalize your Get Out the Count plans and figure out how to operationalize them when the census starts in just a few months. So let's dive right in. Next slide, please. Today, we are focusing on the count of households that are invited to self-respond to the 2020 census with materials that are delivered by mail to about 95% of homes, or by census field staff to most of the remaining 5% of residential homes. And we're going to talk about how you can monitor the progress of the household count through two primary operations: self-response and non-response follow-up. And so that's the framework, those two buckets, for understanding how to keep up with census progress. Next slide, please. So before I dive into the first bucket, let me share with you Terri Ann's first golden rule about understanding what we're going to talk about today. The first is this: when you see the percent of a community or geographic area that has responded to the census, or that the Census Bureau has counted so far, that percent represents housing units out of the universe of all known housing units on the Census Bureau's master address file. That's the master address list. It does not represent the percent of people who have been counted. So when a reporter asks if you're worried that only 60% of your city or your neighborhood's population has responded to the census, please tactfully remind him or her that the number, the percent, refers to housing units or households, and that if the Census Bureau knew how many people there are and where they live, we probably wouldn't need to take a census. Next slide, please. So Terri Ann's golden rule number 2, the indicators of census progress that we are reviewing today, in other words, how well the census is going, do not tell us how accurate the population count is. All right, so first and importantly, people can be, and frankly are, missed in households that otherwise are counted. So those are called within household omissions. Just park that somewhere. It's not the point of today's webinar, but I just want you to understand that. And having said that, though, households that don't self-respond are, by general definition, harder to count. And research does show a correlation between failure to self-respond and a higher likelihood of being missed in the census. But the bottom line is that response rates don't tell us about census accuracy. They are flashing red lights that tell us where cooperation is lagging and where we need to target resources and get out the count activities. Next slide, please. So let's dive, with that context, here we go. How will the Census Bureau report progress during the census, and what will those numbers mean? Here's a quick look back at 2010, because we know that you, or at least your mayors and county commissioners and other officials who always like to do better, will want to make some comparisons back to 2010. So in 2010, remember, mailing back a paper questionnaire was the only way to self-respond, with minimal exceptions that we will not worry about. And so the self-response operation in 2010 and before 2010 was called the mail response phase. And there were two measures of progress, one available in real time and the other well after the fact. The mail response rate told us how well the census was unfolding in real time. It represented the percent of all known housing units that mailed back a questionnaire in areas where that operation was available. By the way, that covered most but not all communities. Now, why the universal denominator in real time while we're going through the mail response or the self-response period? Because at that point, the Census Bureau doesn't yet know which homes are occupied or vacant. So that's why I'm referring still to housing units, not households. Now, the second measure of progress is really just a refinement of the first and is an after-the-fact indicator. The mail return rates were an adjustment of the mail response rates, if you will, that reflected the percent of occupied housing units, which you can now call households, that self-responded to the census. And so the mail return rate really is a truer measure of cooperation during the census, and is essential to evaluate your outreach and promotion efforts in hindsight, but it's not an indicator of census progress in real time. And finally, a very quick word about the term participation rates. The Census Bureau coined that new term after the 2010 census had started, and it was meant to convey a better sense of how many households participated in the census. In my humble opinion, it's a bit misleading because many observers, it gives people the impression that that's the number of people that have been counted in the census. And so in a nutshell, final 2010 census participation rates were comparable to the mail return rates. And Steve will discuss that more in a moment. Next slide, please. Okay, fast forward to the task at hand, 2020. There will be 3 ways to answer the census, to self-respond on your own, as you know. So instead of mail response rates, they'll be called self-response rates. Print this slide, tack it to the wall next to your desk. The self-response rates will reflect the percent of all known housing units, in other words, those on the master address file. We're not talking about group facilities, group quarters, and whether those units are occupied, vacant, or not existent, meaning it's a bad address. In the mail out or update leave universes for each geographic area for which they'll report, again, Steve will talk about that respond to the census or have responded to the census online, by telephone, or using a paper questionnaire, and that will be reported in a certain frequency, and then the cutoff date will be April 30th in most places. Next slide, please. All right, now, after all field operations have ended, and probably we'll learn this in the fall of 2020, the Census Bureau release what we think they're going to call final self-response rates. And those will be comparable to the mail return rate from 2010. All right, the denominator then shifts to the percent of occupied housing units, in other words, households that self-responded at any point during the census field operations online, by telephone, or using a paper form, right? And again, these final rates will be useful for evaluation purposes at the end. Next slide, please. All right, so we're moving to the second bucket now, a non-response follow-up, what we call NRFU. The next 2 slides talk about what we will know during that operation. So as you know, after self-response, the census has a long way to go. Once the door knocking operation, NRFU, starts, which is on May 9th in most areas, you will still want to know how much progress the Census Bureau is making to contact and enumerate all households that didn't self-respond. That could be 20%, 30%, 50% of all homes, depending on the community. Of course, some of those will turn out to be vacant. At that point, the Census Bureau will shift to reporting what's called completion rates, all right? That is the percent of all known housing units, again, including, by the way, any not previously on the master address list that an enumerator might spot when he or she is walking, counting, knocking on doors, such as a trailer, an occupied trailer behind a rural home. So the percent of all known housing units that have been enumerated by self-response, in person, or using another counting method, or have been confirmed as vacant, until the Census Bureau reaches 100% of all known cases, meaning housing units in a given area. Next slide, please. And this slide, I'm not going to walk through it, shows you the ways in which the Census Bureau, once we move to the NRFU operation, and then try to close out to complete the census, the different methods they use to do that. All right, next slide, please. I'm about to wrap up. Back to golden rule number 2. Just a reminder that enumerating 100% of the known housing units doesn't tell us how accurate the census is. And so, you know, there will be more information. The measurement of accuracy is a topic for another day. Next slide, please. But for now, I just want to thank you for listening to this dictionary of census terminology. My partner in census crime, Steve Romalewski, will tell you the important stuff, how to track all of this information, and how to use those indicators to help guide, improve, and adjust the work you are doing in real time. So thank you again. Steve, over to you.
Thanks very much, Terri Ann. I feel like every time I hear Terri Ann explain all of this, it's like attending a master class in what the census is all about. So this is really great. Hopefully I will begin to come close to that, although nowhere near that, I'm sure, as far as the information I'll try to impart. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. So I manage the CUNY mapping service at the Center for Urban Research at the City University of New York. We're the team that created and maintains the hard-to-count map that's online that hopefully you've all been able to use to prioritize areas that you'll be doing get out to count for and doing census outreach and education around, that contains a wealth of information beyond, as Terri Ann pointed out, the final mail return rates from 2010. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the slides. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about what data you will have that we understand so far in spring of 2020 to measure the self-response and potentially the non-response follow-up response rates. I'll talk about what we're planning to do, and these plans are not set in stone, and we really would appreciate feedback that you might have or suggestions about how to develop that better. So plans to provide you with some analysis and visualizations of the information that will be available, and then some suggestions and ideas about how to use that data appropriately to evaluate the success and the progress of your get out the count efforts. So next slide, please. So as far as what we know now, based on what the Census Bureau has communicated to us, starting in March 20th in the afternoon, the Census Bureau will be publishing on a day-to-day basis, they say, self-response rates. And as Terri Ann explained, that will reflect the share of housing units really in each type of area, and I'll talk about which areas the data will be available for, have responded on their own, filled out the census questionnaire, whether it's online or if they've called it in or if they've requested a paper questionnaire and submitted their answers that way. So that will be the overall self-response rate for each area. Separately, the Census Bureau says they'll be providing a self-response rate just for households that responded online. So that'll be an internet self-response rate, and comparable self-response rates from 2010 that will reflect what the share of housing units that self-responded during the 2010 self-response operation at the end of that self-response operation. So it's kind of like a goalpost that you can look to compare against. They're not going to, as far as we know, they're not going to be producing or publishing what the equivalent day-to-day self-response rates were from 2010. They'll be providing that final self-response rate from 2010 that we can compare against and strive towards and hopefully improve upon. The information, again, as far as we know, will be available from the Census Bureau through their API or application programming interface. So if you are working with people who are developing applications that have the ability to access data programmatically from the Census Bureau, you'll be able to access these self-response rates. The Census Bureau says, we hope they'll follow through on this, that the file also, or the data also will be available to be downloaded as, an overall file, so that any of us that don't have access to sophisticated programming technology can just download the data, put it into Excel, and work with it that way, or whatever software you use to analyze data. The Census Bureau says they'll have an online map that will provide this information. We don't know exactly what that is yet, but they're planning to do that. We at the CUNY Graduate Center will be integrating this information into the hard-to-count map, and the link is there in the slide, and I'm sure you'll all get the slides afterwards, so you don't have to write that down. And then I'm sure there'll be other efforts by states or municipalities or other organizations, local stakeholders, that'll be providing access to that information once they get it from the Census Bureau. I should point out that as far as we know, the Census Bureau may also include other information about the area for which they have the self-response rates. We don't know if that's the case. In 2010, they just provided the self-response rate, or they were calling it the participation rate at the time, and nothing else, no other demographic information, just a 2000 rate, 2010 rate on a week-by-week basis, and that was it. They may provide more this time. We'll see. We don't know that yet. Next slide, please. Again, as far as we know, and someone I see just posted a question about this, the Census Bureau will publish the self-response rates, so the overall self-response rate, the internet self-response rate, and the comparable 2010 final self-response rate for these geographies. So importantly, the smallest area, as far as what they're anticipating now, will be census tract and also tribal census tracts. They're not going to be providing the data for state legislative districts, for example, or for unincorporated places or villages, only for incorporated places. Importantly, since we won't have the underlying counts of housing units that are on the master address file and the number of housing units or households that have responded, we won't be able to calculate the rates for any other areas unless the Census Bureau decides to do that for us. So it'll only be for these geographic regions. Next slide, please. So just to re-emphasize, and I'll have two slides that'll talk about this, following on what Terri Ann was describing. So the self-response rates are really only comparable to, from 2020, are only comparable to what the Census Bureau will be providing as self-response rates from 2010. The self-response rates from 2020 won't be comparable to what we have used, for example, the 2010 mail return rates, to use as the metric of areas that are hard to count that we incorporate into the hard to count map, because it's a different measurement, reflects a different universe or a different denominator, and so it won't be directly comparable. Also, it won't be directly comparable to what the Census Bureau has been using through their low response score, which is available through the Rome mapping website that they have. That's a different way of measuring or predicting self-response. Nor will it be comparable to the 2010 participation rates. As Terri Ann pointed out, it's a misleading term, and it's frustrating that the Census Bureau has published these participation rates for 2010, and people are already using that to say, well, we did the X% participation in 2010, we're going to do 5 or 10% better than that this year. You won't be able to compare it directly to the 2010 participation rates. You'll only be able to compare it to the 2010 self-response rates, because it's, again, it's a different, slightly different universe. And also, you may be aware that the Census Bureau has now published the tract level self-response rates for the American Community Survey through the 2017 period, and those also are not going to be comparable. So really, if you can go to the next slide, can't emphasize this enough, the only thing you should compare the 2020 self-response rates to are the 2010 self-response rates that will be provided by the Census Bureau in the same package that they'll be making available starting in March 20th next year. Next slide. So some ideas for how to use this information. You've probably been thinking about this already, but And Terri Ann alluded to this, so if you're looking at the self-response rates in one part of your community or from one city to the next or one town to the next in your region, you'll be able to get a sense day to day, but we'll talk about that in a second, how those areas are doing as far as self-response goes, and perhaps then where you might want to redeploy your get out the count efforts to another area that is not doing as well. Since the Bureau will be publishing separately an internet self-response rate, you'll be able to use that to get a sense of which areas either may need help filling out the questionnaire online, or that you might want to focus on those areas and lift up other ways of self-responding, whether it's through phone or going to the library if they don't have home internet access and filling it out there, or requesting a paper questionnaire and helping householders in those areas do that. We will be able to track change over time as far as the self-response rate goes, and the rates will be published daily. We're not sure yet how meaningful the daily changes might be or might reflect. Week by week might be better. Generally speaking, based on the 2010 participation rates that the Census Bureau provided in real time, generally the rates increased week by week until they kind of plateaued just before the non-response follow-up operation. But that may be different depending on which area you're looking at and which part of your community. So the day-to-day change might be interesting, but probably the week by week might be more meaningful. Again, the Bureau will be publishing comparable 2010 self-response rates, and that will be from the end of the self-response operation from 2010. So it's kind of like a goalpost to strive towards. We did X% in our community, did X% in 2010 as far as self-response. Let's try to do X% better than that, or at least meet that goal as the day-to-day numbers are being published. And then when the self-response operation ends, as Terri Ann was indicating, then the operation will switch to the door-to-door enumeration phase, the non-response follow-up. And so you'll be able to see which areas did, in your estimation, pretty well in terms of self-response, and which ones didn't, and therefore which areas will have a large number of enumerators coming to them to knock on a lot of those households or housing units that didn't self-respond. So you'll be able to gauge that as well and figure out how to redeploy your get out the count resources for the non-response follow-up operation. Next slide, please. So in 2010, our team worked very closely with Terri Ann and the SCI team in general to the moment the Census Bureau published their self-response rates from 2010 on a Friday afternoon. We downloaded that data and immediately started analyzing it and put together an analysis week by week of various aspects of the trends that we saw in the data and the patterns. And then we also integrated that information into our then version of the hard to count map. And the Census Bureau did something similar as well. Like I said, in 2020, they'll have an online map. They had one in 2010. And they made a big deal about the weekly rates. So we're planning to do something similar, excuse me, in 2020. Again, we don't know exactly what that's going to be, but it'll be similar to what we did in 2010. So the next slide. So we did things like which counties were doing better on a week-to-week basis, or how they compared to what they were doing in 2000. And so you could gauge on a regional basis what was happening around the country. Next slide. We also looked very fine-grained at individual tracks that performed either very well or not very well at all. And so we gave some examples of that. You don't need to read through these slides. These are just screenshots of the type of analysis that with Terri Ann we published on a week-to-week basis. Next slide. And just some other ways of comparing the data. Basically, we looked at urban and rural trends, cities and how major cities were doing, trends by county. We looked at individual tracks within communities, and also compared the self-response rates to demographic characteristics. to get a sense of which population groups seem to be doing better or not as well as far as self-response goes. And then we also incorporated that information into what was then the version of our hard to count map from 2010. As I mentioned, this time around, the 2020 self-response rates will not be comparable directly or easily to the 2010 mail return rates that we use now to highlight on the hard to count map. So we understand that, we realize that, and so we're trying to figure out the best way of presenting the information, so the 2020 self-response rates, so it's not confusing. And as I recall, what we did in 2010 was we just simply added a completely new mapped layer by tract and other geographies that represented the 2010 rate. And you would, the default view of the map was to just look at that information. And also, as you can see from the screenshot, we highlighted with those little red check marks how if a census tract had done better or much better than the comparable rate from 2000. So we'll probably do something similar to that in 2020. Again, your feedback and suggestions would be greatly appreciated. As we have a better sense of what our plans are, I'm sure we'll be making that information available to the larger stakeholder community, census stakeholder community, and we'll move ahead that way. Next slide. And also one thing that we did in some places after the self-response operation had ended, this is an example of a map that we helped create with the New York Community Trust, which was involved, as Sol was mentioning, in the Census Equity Fund from 2010, is we helped them map the areas that their census stakeholders, that their grantees had worked in, and we were able to then get a sense for those areas, how well did the self-response rates compare to the prior census, to get a sense of what their measure of success was. And so you might want to look to what they did and think about how you might be able to do that in your own communities as well. Next slide. And then just lastly, to end off with a slide that has some links, and again, you'll be able to see the slides themselves, so you can view these links to some more information about these types of self-response metrics. There's a link here for an explainer that the Pew Research Center produced in 2010 that went into a little bit more depth for what Terri Ann was trying to explain about how these rates are different and what the implications are of those differences, and then other links if you want to look at the actual data from 2000, going back to 1990. Not that those comparisons will be that helpful, since there have been a lot of demographic changes since then. Really, the main thing is to look back to the comparable rate the Census Bureau will be producing from 2010 to compare with 2020. But for your reference, there are these links there. So that's it for now, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to take those. And I see that there are some questions listed, so I guess the moderators will help us go through those. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, both Terri Ann and Steve, for those really informative presentations. You heard a lot today, and hopefully that'll help you with planning moving forward. But this is only the beginning of the conversation. This is gonna be a conversation that is gonna be ongoing, and where we'll get more clarity and just be linked into to all that you heard today in actual real time as we continue to move forward. I wanted to. We have 20 minutes for questions. For those of you on Zoom that want to ask questions, please type your question into the Q&A box. And as Steve mentioned, there's a few questions in there now. If you are on only by phone, unfortunately, you will not be able to ask a question. I'm sorry about that. As a reminder, this discussion is being recorded and will be available online. We will prioritize questions that are related to monitoring the count in real time. Resources for other census operation topics are available on the Census Counts and FCI websites. So let's go with the questions. The first question here, Terri Ann, perhaps for you. From Ann Cass, what about areas with high number of PO boxes who will not receive a paper ballot? How do you evaluate rates in those areas?
Great. So great question. I want everyone to know Ann Katz is a superstar census advocate and community organizer down along the Rio Grande Valley, Tex-Mex border. So thank you, Ann, for that. So just to clarify, most rural areas, even those where people only get their mail at PO boxes, will receive a paper form. Right. It's going to be a very small number of households that are enumerated from the start in person. They won't get any materials in the mail. They won't get any materials dropped off at the door. So I think you're referring to the update leave. All right. Update, remember, /leave operation. There's more on that from the very first webinar in March, folks, where census workers will drop off the materials and update the address list as they go. But those households will receive a paper form in that package. And so they are in the self-response universe, and those, they will be included in the self-response rates. So you're on mute.
I'm on mute. So thank you. Okay, so the next question that we have here is also for you, Terri Ann. The presentation, this is from, I'm sorry, Maria Filippelli. The presentations might get to this. Well, actually, that's what it was written, but how will ID and non-ID be handled in the return rates? I've heard some of the conversations with the Bureau that only ID responses will be accounted.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there. Ship to shore. I'll start, Steve. If you want to add anything, please jump in. I think the Bureau is still trying to deal with this, but remember, everybody, again, the bottom line, look at this, you know, just a reminder, go back to the self-response presentation from the March webinar, but there people will be able to respond without their unique ID number that they received with their census package. So if the Census Bureau can match your address to the master address file quickly, then they might be able to roll that into the self-response rates fairly quickly. But if they need to verify the address, or if there's some question about whether it's a duplicate response, or whether it may be, by the way, somebody who wasn't included on a form that already was sent back in using whatever method from that household, then I think the Census Bureau will probably hold back from including non-ID responses in the real-time self-response rates. Obviously, those will be captured in the hindsight rates, the what used to be the mail return rates, but will be the final self-response rates based only on occupied housing units far later in the year. Steve, am I correct that the Census Bureau hasn't really said exactly how and when they're going to incorporate the non-ID responses?
As far as I know, that's correct. I should point out that the Census Bureau so far has been very responsive, not to use a pun, to our questions about what the self-response rates in real time will be. They've given us great information, very timely, and so we can definitely follow up with them and try to clarify that and provide that to the participants in the webinar and more generally. So we'll do that. And I also just wanted to point out that regarding the areas that are rural or more rural and might be counted through the update enumerate operation, or that may be part of the update leave operation where the census staff will just leave the instructions at the doorstep. I added a link as an example to the chat box that you can see those areas through the hard to count map. And for each tract or county or state, you'll be able to quantify that the share of households or housing units that'll be part of those operations, so you can get a sense of what's going to be happening locally. And I should also point out that the Census Bureau has updated that information and will be adding that updated information shortly to the hard to count map.
Great, thank you, Steve. So another question is about whether or not the Bureau is publishing non-response follow-up rates.
So, Steve, I'll just start, but please jump in again. So again, those folks that that goes back to what I talked about in the non-response follow-up operation bucket. Once the Census Bureau moves into the second big phase of the household enumeration, they will switch to completion rates. All right, so it's not response rates per se, although you could look at it that way, right? But it may be through an in-person interview. It may have been because the Census Bureau determined a housing unit is vacant, but they've completed the enumeration of that vacant housing unit. That's important. It may be they've had to ask a neighbor, remember, after the third unsuccessful knock on the door. So that's a proxy response. And then at the very end, they may have to fill in the count for a household, the information using administrative records. They might even do that sooner in that part of the census. And then at the very end, statistical methods. So that's why they shift from calling them response rates, because there's a lot of methods involved, to completion rates.
Great, thank you, Terri Ann. There's a couple of questions about asking for specific examples of how communities have used this data, the real-time data, to inform their operations and outreach that haven't yet been mentioned.
Well, I'm going to totally defer on that one to you, Sol Marie, because you did it in 2010. I think Beth Link, who's heading up the Census Counts campaign, I think has some useful information there. And Steve, you're the map guy. Everybody relies on you. So over to everybody else.
Hey, Beth, do you have any?
Sure. And Sol, I think would also be helpful kind of how y'all looked at it in 2010 as well. From the Census Counts campaign side, we know that having the ability to see kind of where the response rates are in live time, week to week, during the campaign is going to be incredibly critical to organizers that are planning campaign activities and folks at the grassroots level on the ground to reorganize. Some specific things that folks can look out for as we move into peak census operations is that there will be for State Count Action Network members and GOTC coalition members opportunities to get those live updates weekly, and forthcoming will be additional guidance on how you can think about your list building and looking at your van list building and looking at this data. And so that additional guidance will be forthcoming. I think one specific example that folks can consider is really being able to see, if there is a high response rate. And again, Terri Ann said it at the beginning, I think that the response rates aren't indicative of the accuracy of the census, but it is a way that you can kind of see where the hotspots are and possibly the need to those hard to count communities. And so if you're noticing that there are certain areas where you have resources deployed are being especially successful, and the response rates are higher than expected or on track, and yet other areas in your jurisdiction are having lower response rates, reallocating those resources or deploying activities in major community centers or apartment complex lobbies to engage and educate that community further. So I think it'll be a really good opportunity to try and think about how we're targeting our outreach and using data to our advantage.
Yep. What about you, Steve? Do you have any final thoughts about that?
Well, one thing I was going to note is that, as I mentioned in the slides, so this time will be different in terms of the online response option, and the Census Bureau will be publishing a separate internet self-response rate, and so you will be able to get a sense through that of not only what the overall self-response rate is, but of that, how many households or housing units are responding online, and you'll be able to compare that to the demographics of the community and the share of households that, let's say, don't have internet access, and get a sense of, is that a good response rate or not, and therefore know where you can either focus your GOTC efforts in terms of either helping people fill out the questionnaire online through the libraries or otherwise, but also maybe those areas need, a reminder that you don't have to do it online. You can call in the information, you can request a paper questionnaire, and here are, instructions or materials on how to do that. So that's an example of how the data from 2020 will be helpful.
And so let me just add one thing, Nessa, just to confirm, it is correct that in 2010, the Census Bureau reported the self-response, what they call the mail response rates, right? Only weekly. They will be reporting them daily this time. They will be available daily. But as Steve correctly pointed out, there's only so much you can tell in terms of trends by daily rates, because a number of things could be going on. There could be a lag, if a lot of those are by paper, right? It takes more days to check in, if you will, a paper form as opposed to an online submission or even a telephone response. So I think Steve is correct that looking at sort of the weekly trends or every half week probably is more useful, but they will be available every day if you really want to freak out for 7 weeks.
Right, and I just thank you all of you. I mean, I think that all of that was my experience in 2010. I think everyone kind of captured. We as a funder group were meeting a lot more frequently during self-response period, and as a result of prior to that, at the wise counsel of Terri Ann, we set aside a pot of money, which I mentioned earlier, for rapid response, just not knowing what was going to happen, or just to, in case, and we were really happy about that because we were able to respond in our very regular weekly meetings. We were able to respond to the needs of grantees based on what we were seeing, the response rates that were reported by the Census Bureau. And we also relied a lot on Steve to help us analyze some of that information. And in addition to that, we worked really closely with our Complete Count Committee groups, and and they were kind of mobilized in local communities too. So as this information was coming out, they were able to, in addition to just us getting a few grants out where it was needed, they were able to, if there was a big kind of like artist that was coming into the region and it was slated for X place, but we saw that Y place really needed that person, we worked with the local Complete Count Committee, the local neighborhood, and the national stakeholder to kind of make those changes. So it was, it sounds, hearing both Terri Ann and Steve talk about it, it's like, ooh, that sounds really intimidating. But the hard to count mapping site is so user-friendly, and the information is really accessible. And where there are questions, you can always, just kind of get clarification. And it really is a very useful tool to help inform your work in real time. And it's just not as complicated as it sounds. I mean, there's a lot of information, but it's easy to use. And that's from somebody who has the hardest time even doing these kinds of things. So you don't even want to know the prep that went into that. So that's what I have to say on that. Did you want to say something, Terri Ann, with respect? I mean, I understand that there was a problem with the reporting, and I'm not sure if there's anything we should do about the phone audio being cut off. The computer audio is working. I'm just not sure.
Oh, okay. I think I understand that's or we're not seeing any problem. Cassie Davis, I know she may not be able to hear us, reported problem with the phone line during this webinar, but being told that everything looks okay on our end technically. Unfortunately, I'm not the tech person, but we have made a note, and they're trying to see if there's any problem. Thanks, Sol.
Okay, great.
If I may jump in, this is Steve. If everyone can hear me, I'm on the phone line, so I don't know if that's one of the ones that got cut out. Okay.
Yeah.
So as we've mentioned a couple of times, in 2010, mainly Terri Ann and I, but also in collaboration with others, we went through a weekly analysis of the participation rates and looked at the patterns in all sorts of different ways. And so in terms of how people on the ground might be able to use that information and operationalize it, we're planning to do a similar type of analysis again. But if you have suggestions on how we might be, how we should be, let's say, cross-tabulating the rates by certain demographic characteristics and not others, or for certain types of tracts within cities and outside of cities, please let us know, and we'll see if we can accommodate that and therefore make the numbers, provide more context, more useful context around the numbers and for what your needs are. So think about it more and keep us posted, please. Great.
Thank you, Steve. So there's a question here from Peter Cherzak, and I just want to clarify that the CUNY Hard to Count map will be updated automatically day to day or week by week during the self-response period.
This is Steve. The plan is to update it every day with the new data that we receive from the Census Bureau. We'll probably, Terri Ann and I should talk about this. We haven't decided yet if we'll be analyzing it and producing or publishing an analysis of the numbers, every day, probably more infrequently than that. But the self-response rates themselves, our plan is to integrate that into the Hard to Count map on a daily basis.
Thank you. And then from Ben Zellers, will there be a way to embed the Census Bureau's map of response rates in a city's website?
That's a good question. I don't know if the Census Bureau has decided what type of online map they will have, and I don't know if they'll be sharing the data in mapped form that the city or anyone else can integrate into their local mapping application. But I do know that the Census Bureau will be publishing the self-response rates in 2020 on a day-to-day basis as part of, as I mentioned, this API that the Census Bureau has. And so if anyone working with a municipality, their web development team has accessed that, the Census Bureau says it'll be easy enough to access the self-response rates in the same way. And so if you are working with a web development team that knows what to do with that and integrate it into a local mapping application, you should be able to do that.
Great. And then the final question that I see here is from Ashley Rennick, is the 2010 self-response rates that will be used for goalposts already published somewhere? See.
Okay, so here's the problem. The 2010 self-response rates were what we called, remember back to my presentation, the mail response rates, the real-time rates. And right now, those are not available anymore. Steve, we're wrapping up here, but do you want to just jump in quickly? We did ask the Census Bureau that. Will they make those available before self-response starts, or only once they start reporting the 2020 rates? Will they make the 2010 comparable rates available in real time?
That's a very good question, and I don't know, and we should definitely follow up with the Bureau about that. But I will point out that Terri and I have talked about asking the Bureau to put a note on the places via the Bureau's website where you can access the 2010 participation rates, which again will not be comparable to the 2020 self-response rates. They are different from the 2010 mail response, or in other words, self-response rates. And so we're going to be urging them to explain to people when they go to those websites that these are going to be different than what will be available in real time in or comparable in real time in 2020. So, but we will ask if those actual 2010 self-response rates can be made available ahead of time.
Great. All righty. Looks like that's it for the questions in the queue.
We've answered a few. I answered a few in writing. If people want to scroll, or Jocelyn can make those available in writing when she sends out the slide deck, and Beth as well.
Perfect. So we're at time. Well, we're almost at time. I want to thank you, Terri Ann and Steve, so much for the presentation and all of those great answers. And I know that you'll probably be hearing from all of us, all the 100, 200 of us in the coming months. And I want to turn it over to Jocelyn and Beth. Or not? Beth?
Yes, hi. Hi, everyone. Wanted to thank Sol and Terri Ann and Steve for the wonderful presentation. And thank you for sharing your expertise and your perspective. Thank you to all of our participants who joined by phone and over the Zoom and participated with us on this webinar for the insightful questions. We're really glad to have this fifth in our webinar series. Just a reminder that there were 4 webinars before this. Those are available online at censuscounts.org/webinars or available on the FCI and FCCP website as well. I think we'll be providing those links in the chat box now if you'd like to catch up on the previous webinars, or if you'd like to share the recording of this webinar with your colleagues, it'll be available there. Next month, we'll be having a webinar on field guidance and what organizers can do in terms of outreach and support. And as there were a lot of questions today about how this information connects to the field planning that's underway. A lot of that will be answered on next month's webinar, which will take place on October 16th at 1 p.m. With that concludes the webinar. Thank you again to our panelists and to all of our attendees.